This is a mysterious woman who walked into a recruitment office the morning after the Nazi invasion. The officers laughed and pointed her toward the nursing tent. She asked for a rifle instead. 12 months later, 309 confirmed kills, 36 enemy snipers out-dueled, and the entire Wehrmacht knew her name. They offered her comfort, but she gave them funerals. Then they pulled her off the battlefield and put her on a stage in front of thousands of Americans who had never fired a shot. What she said into that microphone changed a lot of things. Before the riffle, before the war, and before 309 men fell to a trigger, she pulled without hesitation. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was a girl who loved dead civilizations. Born in 1916 in Bila Tserkva, a small Ukrainian city where summers moved slowly and ambitions were supposed to stay modest, she grew up stubborn in a way that made adults uncomfortable. She was not loud about it. She was precise. By her teenage years, she had already become a mother and a factory worker, grinding through shifts at the Kiev arsenal, while raising a son most people thought should have ended her story before it began. But Lyudmila had a habit that no one could account for. She joined a local shooting club, not out of boredom, not as a social exercise. She was tired of hearing boys brag about things she could do better with her eyes half closed. She won competitions. She collected marksman certificates the way other students collected lecture notes. And then she enrolled at Kiev University to study history. Because what fascinated her more than hitting a distant target was understanding why people built things and why other people tore them down. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Adolf Hitler's armies rolled across the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa turned the sky black with bombers. Cities burned before their residents could finish breakfast. The Soviet Union was caught staggering, reeling, bleeding from a wound that stretched across 1,000 miles of frontier. The next morning, Lyudmila Pavlichenko walked into a recruiting office and asked for a rifle. The officers looked at her. 24 years old, slim, a university student with ink stains on her fingers. They offered her a nursing position. She refused. They suggested clerical work. She refused again. Finally, someone handed her a weapon and pointed toward a hill where Romanian soldiers had dug in. She fired 2 shots. 2 soldiers dropped. The laughter in the recruiting office died before the echoes did. Within days, she was assigned to the 25th Chapayev Rifle Division, headed toward a port city called Odessa that was already beginning to burn. She carried her rifle, a handful of ammunition, and a quiet certainty that the men around her were only beginning to understand. The war had found its sharpest instrument, and she had found the thing she was built for. Most soldiers are given weeks of training before they see combat. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was given a rifle and pointed toward a city that was already dying. She went to Odessa, a jewel of a port city on the Black Sea that the Axis powers wanted badly enough to strangle from 3 sides. Romanian and German forces outnumbered the Soviet defenders significantly, and the siege that followed was one of the earliest and most vicious engagements on the Eastern Front. Odessa in the summer of 1941 was a place where beauty and destruction shared the same address. Grand European architecture crumbled under artillery fire. Boulevards built for evening strolls became corridors of rubble. And somewhere in that wreckage, a former university student was learning a new curriculum entirely. The first lessons were physical: how to lie motionless for 8, 10, sometimes 14 hours in heat that cooked the ground beneath her. How to breathe so quietly that even the dust around her did not stir. how to ignore thirst, cramps, and the insects crawling across her hands, because one flinch meant a muzzle flash, and a muzzle flash meant a dead sniper. The second lessons were harder. Through the scope, every target had a face, hands, a way of walking. Some carried photographs they would look at when they thought no one was watching. Lyudmila saw all of it, and she pulled the trigger anyway. Not out of cruelty, but because the alternative was letting them advance into a city full of civilians who had nowhere left to run. She developed a method. She studied terrain the way she once studied historical texts, reading the landscape for patterns, for repetitions in enemy movement, for the habits that soldiers fall into when they believe they are safe. She never fired from the same position twice. She arrived before dawn and left after dark. She became something the enemy could feel but never find. Her count climbed. 10, 40, 80. Each number verified by a spotter, logged in a regiment ledger, reported up the chain of command. By the time Soviet forces were ordered to evacuate Odessa by sea in October of 1941, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had 187 confirmed kills. She had been at war for barely 4 months. The evacuation itself was chaos. Ships overloaded with soldiers and civilians pulled away from the docks under bombardment. Lyudmila boarded one of them, carrying nothing but her rifle and the weight of what she had just survived. Odessa fell behind her, burning against the horizon. But the war was not finished with her. Command had a new assignment, a new city that needed defending, a siege that would make Odessa look like a rehearsal. They were sending her to Sevastopol, and Sevastopol would test every limit she had left. There is a particular kind of war that happens between two people lying perfectly still, sometimes for days, each one waiting for the other to make a single mistake. That was Lyudmila Pavlichenko's specialty, and 36 enemy snipers learned the cost of losing to her. By the time she reached Sevastopol's outer defenses in late 1941, the Germans had started piecing together a problem. Officers were falling in sectors where no assault was underway. Soldiers were being struck from distances that ruled out ordinary infantry fire. And the shots were too precise, too deliberate, too patient to be random. Someone on the Soviet side was hunting with a method that felt almost scientific. They were right. Lyudmila had turned sniping into a discipline closer to research than combat. She kept mental maps of every position she had used and never returned to one. She cataloged wind patterns across different terrain. She memorized the schedules of enemy patrols the way a doctoral student memorizes source material, looking for the one inconsistency that revealed a weakness. But the real test was not shooting soldiers. It was shooting snipers. Counter-sniper warfare is the quietest and most psychologically brutal contest on any battlefield. Two trained marksmen, both concealed, both scanning through scopes, both aware that the first one to reveal their position is the one who does not go home. There is no charging, no shouting, no adrenaline rush of a frontal assault. There is only stillness, patience, and the slow erosion of nerve. Lyudmila excelled at this because she understood something her opponents often did not. The contest was not about marksmanship. It was about time. The sniper who could wait longer, endure more discomfort, resist the urge to shift or stretch or check a watch. That was the sniper who survived. And Lyudmila could wait longer than almost anyone alive. Some of these duels lasted hours. Others stretched across days, with both shooters returning to the same contested zone each morning, probing for the faintest clue, a glint of glass, a shadow that didn't match the rubble. a tuft of camouflage that sat wrong against the landscape. The loser might never even hear the shot that ended it. She eliminated 36 enemy snipers over the course of her combat service. 36 engagements where one wrong breath, one misread shadow, a 1 second of lost concentration would have meant her end instead of theirs. Each of those duels required her to become something closer to stone than flesh, to slow her heartbeat, to let hours dissolve, to exist in a suspended state between absolute calm and the split-second explosion of a trigger pull. The German command began to understand what they were dealing with. This was not a lucky conscript. This was a specialist, and she was systematically removing their best shooters from the field. They started asking for her name, and when they got it, they decided to make her a target unlike any other. Sevastopol did not fall quickly. It took 250 days of relentless bombardment, and by the end, the city looked less like a place where people had lived and more like the surface of the moon. Lyudmila Pavlichenko arrived in a fortress that the entire German war machine was trying to crack open. Sevastopol sat on the Crimean Peninsula, a naval stronghold the Soviets could not afford to lose, and the Wehrmacht could not afford to ignore. Hitler ordered its capture at virtually any cost, and the cost was staggering on both sides. The siege began in earnest in late 1941 and ground forward through the winter and into the spring of 1942. The Luftwaffe bombed the city so heavily that entire neighborhoods ceased to exist between sunrise and noon. Naval guns hammered positions from the sea. The Germans deployed some of the largest artillery pieces ever built. Weapons so enormous, they had to be transported by rail and assembled on site. The ground shook so constantly that soldiers stopped flinching. Whilst there was no point, the shaking never stopped. Inside the perimeter, conditions deteriorated week by week. Food supplies dwindled. Ammunition was rationed so carefully that every bullet had to justify itself. Soldiers slept in shifts inside ruins, always listening, always waiting for the next barrage. Fresh water became precious. Medical supplies ran short, and the wounded often had to wait days for treatment. Lyudmila operated in this environment the same way she had in Odessa, only now everything was worse. The rubble provided cover, but it also shifted unpredictably. Positions that were safe at dawn could be flattened by midday. She adapted constantly, reading the destruction the way a sailor reads waves, anticipating where the next collapse would open a new line of sight or seal one off. Her kill count continued to grow, and the Germans, who by now knew exactly who was responsible, escalated their response. Loudspeakers were set up along the front lines, broadcasting messages aimed directly at her. They offered her a commission in the German army. They promised comfort, safety, a new life far from the trenches. When flattery failed, the tone shifted. A voice crackled across the ruins with a threat tailored to her personal record. "We will tear you into 309 pieces." She never responded verbally. She did not need to. Every morning she returned to her position, found her concealment, and answered the only way she knew how. One trigger pull at a time. But Sevastopol was consuming everyone inside it, and Lyudmila was no exception. The months of constant shelling, sleepless nights, and the psychological toll of sustained combat were grinding her down, and that she had survived longer than most snipers ever do. Statistically, the average life expectancy of a frontline sniper on the Eastern Front was measured in weeks, not months. She had lasted nearly a year, and then, in June of 1942, the war finally reached her body. A mortar does not care how many enemies you have eliminated. It does not distinguish between a new recruit and the deadliest sniper on the Eastern Front. It simply lands, and the world divides into before and after. In June of 1942, during one of the countless bombardments that defined Sevastopol's final weeks, a mortar round struck close enough to Lyudmila Pavlichenko to end her combat career in an instant. Shrapnel tore into her, leaving wounds severe enough that field medics prioritized her evacuation. She was pulled from the line, carried through the wreckage of a city she had helped defend for months, and placed on a transport away from the front. Her war with a rifle was over. 309 confirmed kills, 36 enemy snipers among them. Nearly a full year of sustained frontline combat in two of the most punishing sieges the Eastern Front had produced. She had outlasted statistical probability by a factor that military analysts still study. But the Soviet leadership saw something in her survival that went beyond battlefield value. They had lost tens of thousands of soldiers defending Sevastopol, and the city would eventually fall to the Germans just weeks after Lyudmila's evacuation. What they needed now was not another sniper. They needed a story, and Lyudmila Pavlichenko was the best story the Red Army had. She was young, she was articulate, she was a mother and a university student who had volunteered on the first day of the invasion and outperformed every male sniper in her division. In a war that was consuming millions of anonymous lives, she had a name, a face, and a number that staggered the imagination. The propaganda machine recognized immediately what it had, and it moved fast. While her wounds healed, Soviet officials began preparing her for a role she had never imagined and certainly never trained for. They were going to send her abroad, not with a rifle, but with a message. The Soviet Union desperately needed the Western allies to open a second front in Europe to relieve the crushing pressure on the Eastern Front, and they believed a young woman who had personally fought 309 engagements could shame the comfortable democracies into action. Lyudmila had spent a year learning to be invisible. Now they wanted her to stand on stages in front of thousands. She had mastered silence. Now they needed her to speak. It was a transformation that would have broken most people. From the freezing rubble of Sevastopol to the polished halls of Western diplomacy. From a world measured in trigger pulls to one measured in handshakes and headlines. She was no longer a soldier. She was a symbol. And symbols, as she would soon discover, carry a weight that is entirely different from a rifle, but no less exhausting. The Soviet Union pointed her west. Her next battlefield would be the United States of America. And this time, the enemy was not a soldier in a scope. It was indifference. She had survived 2 sieges, 36 sniper duels, and a mortar blast that nearly ended her life. But nothing prepared Lyudmila Pavlichenko for the American press corps. In the autumn of 1942, she arrived in the United States as part of a small Soviet delegation tasked with rallying public support for the Allied war effort. The mission was simple on paper: convince Americans that the Eastern Front was their fight too, and that a second front in Western Europe was not a luxury, but a necessity. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians were perishing. The delegation needed the West to act. Lyudmila stepped off the plane in Washington, D.C. in her military uniform, carrying medals earned in actual combat, and immediately discovered that American journalists had a very different set of priorities. They asked about her hair. They asked about her weight. They wanted to know if she wore makeup while fighting. One reporter criticized her uniform skirt for being too long, suggesting it made her look heavy. Another asked what color of underwear she preferred in the trenches. Here was a woman who had eliminated more enemy combatants than any Allied sniper then serving, and the questions she faced would not have been out of place in a fashion magazine. It was absurd, and Lyudmila, who had spent a year learning to suppress every emotion behind a rifle scope, handled it with a composure that barely concealed her disbelief. She answered the trivial questions briefly and redirected every conversation back to the war, back to Sevastopol, back to the reality that thousands were dying daily while these reporters debated hemlines. But Washington offered something the press conferences did not. She was invited to the White House, becoming the first Soviet citizen to be officially received there. She met President Franklin Roosevelt, who treated her with the gravity her record deserved. And she met Eleanor Roosevelt. That meeting changed both of their lives. Eleanor saw through the propaganda packaging immediately. She recognized a woman carrying enormous trauma beneath an impossible assignment. The two connected not as political figures or wartime symbols, but as individuals. Eleanor later wrote that Lyudmila carried a sadness in her eyes that no amount of public composure could hide, and that she understood instantly this was someone who had seen things that could never fully be spoken about. Their friendship would last decades, sustained through letters that crossed the Iron Curtain long after the war ended. What in a conflict defined by ideology and suspicion between East and West, the bond between a Soviet sniper and an American First Lady was quietly remarkable. But the propaganda tour was not over. Lyudmila still had speeches to give, crowds to face, and a message to deliver. She had been patient with the journalists. She had been diplomatic in Washington. But in Chicago, she would stop being polite entirely. And the words she chose would echo for the next 80 years. For weeks, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had been polite. She had answered the ridiculous questions. She had smiled through the condescension. She had watched a nation that had not yet felt the full weight of war treat her like a curiosity rather than a combat veteran. In Chicago, she decided she was done. The rally was large, one of several stops on a tour that had taken her across the United States and into Canada. The audiences at these events were generally sympathetic, but distant. They clapped in the right places. They nodded when she described the Eastern Front. But there was a gap between hearing about a war and understanding one, and Lyudmila could feel it every time she looked out at a crowd that had never heard artillery shake the walls of their homes. She stepped to the microphone. The hall quieted. And then, in a voice steady enough to carry across a battlefield, she delivered the words that would define her legacy far beyond her kill count. Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have already killed 309 fascist invaders. Oh, don't you think you've been hiding behind my back long enough? The silence that followed was not the polite pause of a listening audience. It was the silence of people who had just been confronted with a truth they could not argue with. A young woman, barely past university age, had fought and survived what most of the men in that room would never experience. And she was looking them in the eye and asking why she had to carry that burden while they sat in comfort. Then the applause came. Not polite clapping, but a roar that shook the hall. Something shifted in that moment. The tour stopped being a diplomatic exercise and became a reckoning. Newspapers that had mocked her uniform reprinted the quote on their front pages. Radio stations broadcast it coast to coast. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who had spent a year as an invisible ghost on the Eastern Front, was suddenly the most visible woman soldier in the world. The ripple effects were immediate and lasting. Woody Guthrie, the legendary folk singer, was so moved that he wrote a song in her honor called Miss Pavlichenko, turning her into an anthem for a generation of Americans who were beginning to understand the true scale of the war. Her image appeared in newsreels, magazines, and posters. She became a symbol not just of Soviet resilience, but of something more universal: the idea that courage does not ask permission before choosing its vessel. She continued the tour through Canada and the United Kingdom, speaking to crowds that grew larger and more engaged at every stop. The diplomatic mission was working. The pressure on Allied leadership to open a second front was mounting. But Lyudmila knew something her audiences did not. Every speech she gave, every hand she shook, every flashbulb that went off in her face took her further from the woman she had been and closer to something she never wanted to become: a performer, a product, a story with a number attached to it. And eventually, the tour would end. The cameras would stop, and she would have to figure out who she was without the rifle or the microphone. The guns stopped in 1945, but for Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the silence that replaced them was not peace. It was a different kind of siege, one that no medal or commendation could defend against. She returned to the life she had planned before the invasion. She completed her degree at Kyiv University, or the same institution she had walked away from 4 years earlier when she chose a rifle over a textbook. She became a historian and senior researcher for the Soviet Navy, a role that suited her intellect and allowed her to work with the kind of archival material she had always loved. She also served as an instructor, training a new generation of snipers, passing on the techniques that had kept her alive when probability said she should not have survived. On paper, it looked like a successful reintegration. A war hero turned academic, a decorated soldier building a quiet, productive civilian life. But paper does not record what happens at 3 in the morning when the apartment is dark and the mind refuses to stop replaying things the body survived years ago. Lyudmila struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. What in the Soviet Union of the 1940s and 50s, there was no clinical framework for this condition and very little institutional sympathy. Soldiers were expected to serve, return, and resume. The idea that combat left invisible injuries, that the mind could be wounded as severely as the body, was not part of the official vocabulary. Veterans who could not simply move on were often left to manage their pain in private. She drank, not publicly, not scandalously, but in the way that many veterans of her era did, quietly numbing the edges of memories that refused to fade. The woman who had maintained superhuman stillness for hours behind a scope now found it difficult to sit still in an ordinary room. Without her thoughts pulling her back to Odessa, to Sevastopol, to the faces she had seen through crosshairs. But her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt endured across the Cold War divide. Letters moved between Moscow and the United States, two women separated by ideology and geography, but connected by something they had recognized in each other during those brief days in 1942. Eleanor understood loss. She understood duty performed at personal cost, and she understood that some burdens do not lighten with time. Lyudmila never sought the spotlight again. She lived in Moscow, far from the stages and the cameras, far from the journalists who had once asked about her lipstick, while she carried the weight of 309 lives on her conscience. She did not give interviews. She did not write a memoir. The woman the Germans had called Lady Death chose to spend her remaining years in near total obscurity. On October 10th, 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in Moscow. She was 58 years old. The Soviet Union issued a commemorative postage stamp. The world, largely, did not notice. The deadliest female sniper in history slipped away as quietly as she had once lain in the rubble, waiting for a shot that would never come again. History has a habit of burying its most extraordinary people in footnotes. For decades, that is exactly where Lyudmila Pavlichenko stayed. Then the world dug her up. After her death in 1974, her story faded into the kind of obscurity that swallows most wartime figures once the generation that knew them begins to disappear. Soviet records preserved her statistics. Military historians occasionally referenced her in academic texts. But for the general public, Lady Death was little more than a name attached to a number, if she was remembered at all. The Cold War did not help. Western narratives about the Second World War tended to center on their own heroes, their own campaigns, their own sacrifices. Soviet contributions, despite being staggering in scale, were often minimized or treated with suspicion. And a female sniper from Ukraine did not fit neatly into any of the stories the West preferred to tell about that era. But silence is not the same as erasure. The facts remained in the archives, stubborn and undeniable. 309 confirmed kills. 36 enemy snipers eliminated in individual duels. A combat record compiled in less than a year under conditions that destroyed entire divisions. No amount of geopolitical rivalry could make those numbers disappear, but the rediscovery began slowly and then accelerated. In 2015, the film Battle for Sevastopol brought her story to a massive audience across Russia and Ukraine, dramatizing her wartime experience and her complicated transition from soldier to symbol. The film was a commercial success and introduced Lyudmila to millions who had never heard her name. Then came the literary revival. Kate Quinn's best-selling novel, The Diamond Eye, published in 2022, reimagined Lyudmila's life for an international readership, blending historical research with narrative fiction. The book climbed charts worldwide and sparked a new wave of interest in the real woman behind the story. And there was Woody Guthrie's folk song, "Died Miss Pavlichenko," written during her 1942 American tour, but rediscovered by a new generation of listeners searching for protest music with historical teeth. The song, simple and direct, captured something the official propaganda never quite could. The absurdity of a young woman carrying the weight of a war while the world debated her appearance. Military analysts revisited her record with modern methodology and confirmed what the Soviet reports had always claimed. Her kill count was not inflated. Her sniper duels were documented by multiple witnesses. Her service record, when placed alongside those of history's most celebrated marksmen, stood not just as comparable, but as exceptional by virtually every measurable standard. A second commemorative stamp was issued. Documentaries appeared on streaming platforms, and her name began showing up in school curricula and military training manuals. The woman who had chosen obscurity in life was becoming, in death, exactly what the Soviet propaganda machine had once tried to make her: unforgettable. But the real question her story leaves behind is not about fame or legacy. It is something far more uncomfortable, and it deserves its own answer. Here is what most people get wrong about Lyudmila Pavlichenko. They remember the number, 309. They remember the nickname, Lady Death. They remember the quote in Chicago that made an entire nation flinch. But they forget the thing that makes her story truly unsettling. She did not want any of it. She wanted to be a historian. She wanted to study the dead civilizations in her textbooks, not create new ones through a rifle scope. And she was not recruited by a secret program. She was not groomed from childhood for combat. She was not some Cold War experiment or a product of ideological fanaticism. She was a woman with a son and a stack of university notes who walked into a recruitment office because her country was being invaded and no one told her she was allowed to sit it out. That is the part of her story that resists comfortable interpretation. We want our warriors to be born for war. We want them to be different from us, built from harder material, wired for violence in a way that ordinary people are not. It makes the distance between their lives and ours feel safe. Lyudmila Pavlichenko collapses that distance entirely. She was ordinary, aggressively, undeniably ordinary. And when the world forced her hand, she became the single deadliest female combatant in recorded military history. The transformation was not cinematic, it was methodical. She applied the same discipline she used in academic research to the study of terrain, wind, and human movement. She replaced footnotes with field reports and thesis deadlines with kill confirmations. The skills that would have made her an exceptional scholar made her an exceptional sniper. The mind was the same, only the application changed. And when the war was done with her, she tried to go back. She finished her degree. She returned to research. She lived quietly, anonymously, in a Moscow apartment, as if 309 lives could be filed away like old lecture notes. They could not. The cost followed her every remaining day. What Lyudmila's story asks of us is not admiration, and it is not gratitude. It is something much harder than either. It asks us to sit with the knowledge that the capacity for extraordinary things, terrible and heroic in equal measure, lives inside people who look exactly like us, who read books like us, who raise children like us, who would have lived perfectly unremarkable lives if history had simply left them alone. She did not choose to become Lady Death. The world chose for her, and she answered with a precision that still echoes 80 years later, asking the same question she asked in Chicago, the same question she asks now, from beyond the grave, to anyone willing to listen. Don't you think you've been hiding long enough? If this story kept you watching till the end, do one thing Lyudmila never had the luxury of doing. Take the easy shot. Hit that like button. Subscribe. See, because the next story we tell might be the one you never saw coming, and you do not want to miss it.